these are your nutrient cycle video notes, and we'll start with a refresher from our last video. Remember that energy flows from producers to consumers and is a unidirectional flow. Remember that only 10% on average of the energy in any one trophic level is transferred from one to the next as you go up your trophic levels. And that's, again, because the rest is being used by the organism to reproduce, to grow as feces, or is lost as heat. Matter, on the other hand, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, etc., is not necessarily unidirectional, and it stays within Earth. It's not re-radiated back out into space or lost back into space like energy is. So matter is recycled in an ecosystem. The impact of comets and asteroids is considered negligible when talking about matter being introduced or being ejected from Earth. So the amount of matter on Earth is constant, or could be considered constant when you're talking about ecosystems and nutrient cycles, right? We're specifically going to talk about the water cycle, the cycling of carbon, the nitrogen cycle, and the phosphorus cycle. So off we go. Oops. Actually, before we do that, we have a reminder. Why are we talking about these cycles? Well, we're talking about these cycles because these are the elements that things are made of, right? Most of your body is made of chomp, right? And sulfur for some amino acids and for some proteins. But this is really the main stuff of your body, right? And remember that when plants, producers are, or anything photosynthetic is taking in sunlight, they're taking in carbon in the form of carbon dioxide, they're taking hydrogen and water in, and they are reconfiguring that into glucose, C6H12O2, or sorry, C6H12O6, and you get oxygen out of that. There's no nitrogen here, right? Plants are not producing anything from photosynthesis that contains nitrogen, phosphorus, or sulfur, etc., right? So how do these come into the bodies of organisms? They come up, if you're a plant, through the roots, right? They come up in the decomposing matter that's released by your bacteria, right? Your other decomposers, your fungus, right? We add these elements to our bodies when we consume food, when you eat dinner, right? So, or when you take vitamins. These are needed to make your proteins, to make things like phospholipids with phosphate groups on them, phospholipids. You need them to make nucleic acids. And we need to talk about them because of their role in organisms. So we'll start with the water cycle. Not going to baby you really at all here with the water cycle. You guys understand the water cycle. We've talked about transpiration, I believe, and if I'm mistaken, we can cover that in class. You'll just have to remind me. But the one thing that I do want to kind of point out is that water needs to seep into the ground, right? There is what's called groundwater, basically underwater lakes, underwater bodies of water that exist because rainwater seeps through soil, right? This is the same water that a lot of plants use to access from their deep root structures. It's also the same water that if you ever had a little well, I'm going to draw a little well up here, and you pull the bucket up if it's an old one, or if there's a pump, that well and that pump is actually accessing groundwater. If you go out west, or if you're familiar with the Great Plains, where does a lot of the water come for a lot of our agricultural fields? It actually comes from groundwater. And if the area of groundwater is big enough, it gets a name called an aquifer. So an aquifer is just an underground water storage. And actually, there's an aquifer called the Ogallala aquifer underneath a lot of the plain states that we are actually rapidly depleting. So it's probably one of the lesser known aspects of the water cycle, but the rest of the water cycle is pretty intuitive and straightforward, and I'm sure you've seen it before. And again, we're recycling oxygen and hydrogen here, but again, in the form of water. So other things about this, you are made of water, right? Your cytoplasm is mostly water. Life as we know it is reliant on water. You'll learn more about this in AP biology if you take AP biology, but the oxygen in water is the final electron acceptor in cell respiration, and this is why oxygen in drinking water is so important for cell respiration, but it comprises you. It's the medium, it's the substance where all of your chemical reactions occur, again, like in your cytoplasm. Transpiration, we actually will talk about it here. Transpiration is water lost by plants through the leaves. You don't have to know the details of how it works. Basically, if you have a little plant here, there's the leaves and the trunk, and then there's the soil, and then you've got your roots. For every one water molecule brought up from the roots, the adhesion and the cohesion properties of water, along with capillary action, and the suction of that water, for every one water molecule coming up the roots, one water molecule kind of evaporates off the top of the leaves. And evaporation is kind of the wrong term to use. It's technically transpiration, but every time one water molecule exits a leaf, one water molecule is pulled up from the roots. And that's, again, along with capillary action, is how water moves up a plant. But plants will transpire gallons and gallons of water a day. It's not a rare or a small process. You can get rid of 25 gallons of water per day for a lot of your firs, and a lot of our agricultural plants can go through easily 50 to 60 gallons of water over the course of its life. That's transpiration. It's part of the water cycle. Carbon cycle. We're going to focus on carbon dioxide because that's the form of a lot of the carbon in the carbon cycle, in the form of carbon dioxide. So looking at the big picture here, you've got two main reservoirs of carbon. You have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and you have carbon dioxide in the ocean. Those are your two primary reservoirs. There's a third reservoir, which actually has a lot of carbon as well, in your rock, but most of it that we're going to talk about and the cycling of it, we're going to focus on the atmospheric and the oceanic or the aquatic components of it. So how do you get carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere? And there's really only one main way. It's photosynthesis, right? This is the only real way to get carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide and any gas will dissolve in water depending on the relative concentrations. But basically, if you have high CO2 concentrations in your atmosphere and low CO2 concentrations in your water, you will take in carbon dioxide and slightly acidify the oceans. You'll actually make a mild form of carbonic acid. And then as you have higher levels of concentration of carbon dioxide in your water and lower concentrations of it in the atmosphere, it can actually come back out of solution. But really, the main one here is photosynthesis, right? From there, carbon is modified, the glucose is modified, you're adding nitrogens and phosphoruses, et cetera, and you're building bodies. And then as organisms decompose, that carbon gets released back into the ecosystem and broken down by decomposers. Some of that carbon is respired back into the atmosphere. right? Cell respiration, CO2 is a product of that. So that's how you can return carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Another way to return it to the atmosphere is through volcanic activity, and that's a natural process. And then a final way to reintroduce it to the atmosphere is to burn your carbon-based fossil fuels, which is just very old carbon stores from plants and animals. And then you burn either coal, which is basically plants, or oil, which is basically animals, and that releases CO2 into the environment. So make sure you kind of understand how to take it out of the atmosphere, how to add it into the atmosphere, its role in photosynthesis and cell respiration, and also just pay attention to the fact that this little, I'm going to call them a mini cycle between consumers and producers, is also in the ocean as it is on land. But that is the main crux of your carbon cycle. So most of this is just text form of what we were just talking about. You can go ahead and pause this and jot some of this down. Take a look at it, but it's really just a recap. And I'm going to go on to the next cycle. The nitrogen cycle similarly has an atmospheric component. Nitrogen exists in the form of N2 in the atmosphere, right? So how do we take nitrogen out of the atmosphere? Well, naturally, lightning actually can do it for us. This is called atmospheric nitrogen fixation. It's not one that I'm going to have you really pay a lot of attention to, but it is one natural way for nitrogen to be removed from the atmosphere. The other way is for nitrogen-fixing bacteria that lives on the roots of legumes in colonies called nodules to do something called bacterial nitrogen fixation. We are fixing this unusable form, this N2, this diatomic form of nitrogen. And the bacteria modify it into ammonia, ammonium, nitrates, and nitrites. All right, so that's your NH3. It can further modify it into your nitrates, and your nitrites, NO2. These are the forms that are usable by plants. And then bacteria can also return nitrogen to the atmosphere. Oops, I'm sorry, it goes up through the middle of the diagram here. Right up the middle in a process, again, regulated by bacteria called denitrification. And that's kind of the main cycle. You have nitrogen from the atmosphere being converted into a usable form, ammonia, nitrate, and nitrite, by nitrogen fixation, N fixation, that's an abbreviation, and then returned to the atmosphere using a process called denitrification. So out of the atmosphere, nitrogen fixation, into the atmosphere, denitrification. And again, bacteria are the ones that do this. The other way, again, I'm going to call these mini cycles again, as consumers eat plants and consume their nitrogen levels, and they poop and they decompose, you have these little mini terrestrial cycles of nitrogen that get recycled within producers, consumers, and decomposers. You have another little mini cycle just like that over in your aquatic ecosystems. And then, of course, the human component is we take nitrogen from the atmosphere to use in our synthetic fertilizer production, which we add to fertilizer, sprinkle on our crops, and that actually can cause algae blooms later on, which we'll talk about. Same thing as before, a text summary of what we've talked about and the highlight of why we need to talk about the nitrogen cycle. Again, most of the atmosphere you breathe is nitrogen. About 21% is oxygen. But we need nitrogen for proteins. We need nitrogen for our DNA and RNA. And the two main processes here, again, are nitrogen fixation and denitrification, both done by bacteria. The phosphorus cycle, the last major cycle we're going to talk about. If you look at the image, you'll notice there's one major component missing, and that's an atmospheric component. There is no atmospheric component for the phosphorus cycle. The source of phosphorus is exclusively in your rock. Your rocks containing high levels of phosphorus. And just remember that we need phosphorus on our phospholipids, and we need it on our DNA and RNA, and in a lot of our mineral structures for things like bones. So basically, you have to wait long periods of time, millennia, for rocks to erode by wind, by rain, by the thawing and freezing of ice repeatedly over and over again, by tectonic plate shifts, etc. And only after you have that erosion and that gets deposited into bodies of water can it then be uptaken by your producers and enter again your little mini cycles, either aquatic or terrestrial, and then be part of your producer, consumer, decomposer little mini cycles, right? Humans add to the phosphorus cycle by mining phosphate, adding it to fertilizer, using it for plants, and again, inadvertently contributing to what's called runoff, which we'll end the video today with. So for our limiting nutrients are nutrients that are needed to grow organisms, but are typically in short supply. So like limiting nutrients or limiting factors. Right? In terrestrial ecosystems, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are all considered limiting nutrients. These are the things we add to fertilizer as a result, and this is why we add it to fertilizer. If you're in the ocean, in oceanic saltwater ecosystems, the limiting nutrient is nitrogen, and if you are in freshwater ecosystems, the limiting nutrient is phosphorus. And we can talk more about how we've figured this out in experiments we've done in AP Bio, but for this year, we're just going to summarize what the nutrients are, right? When ecosystems are given large amounts of these nutrients, like with fertilizer and runoff, then you get algae blooms that basically suffocate the local environment, right? And here's the end of the video and kind of a summary of algae blooms. So when we fertilize crops, when we fertilize our flowers and our lawns, a lot of that gets, when it gets rained on, it runs off of hard surfaces, off of roads, off of sidewalks, off of rooftops, off of parking lots, off of cars, etc., into our local streams, and then into our local rivers, and then into our local bays. So like the Chesapeake Bay suffers from this, the Gulf of Mexico suffers from it, and it increases significantly in the spring months because that's when we're planting a lot of our crops and flowers. So when all of those nutrients make their way into their final body of water, the algae, which can use them the best because they grow very quickly, have a field day, right? The algae love this stuff. It's needed for cell respiration, or it's needed to make proteins and to make nucleic acids and to do mitosis and divide, right? So you have these massive populations of algae that explode in numbers, and you get these big visible mats of it, and yes, they block a little bit of the sunlight, and that hurts your autotrophs underneath them. But what happens is that eventually the nutrients are used up, and all of your algae die. And when they die, they are decomposed by bacteria, and that is an aerobic process. That process consumes oxygen. And this is the main reason why a lot of organisms die. They die due to suffocation rather than the blockage of light. But that's what you get when you have an algal bloom. You have a lot of nutrients, then you get a lot of algae reproducing that can divide quickly and take advantage of it. They deplete the nutrients, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and potassium, etc. And then when they die, they are decomposed aerobically by bacteria, which diminishes the free available oxygen in that area, in that body of water, and everything literally suffocates to death. So that's an algae bloom. And then if you are curious about how much of these nutrients are in your fertilizer, what you're adding when you add fertilizer, You should see these three numbers somewhere on the bag. The first is nitrogen, then phosphorus, then potassium, and the percentage of each. So I hope this helped, and I hope this helped you see a little bit more of the big picture and where we're going with ecological impact. And I'll see you next time.